want to begin by thanking Dallas Blair for being here, and with Philip Martinez playing the trumpet. And Dallas, you're his music instructor at school. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Any of you ever run out of gas on the side of the road? Have you ever had that experience? So there was a man who was driving down the road, and he ran out of gas. And just at that moment, a bee flew in through his window. And the bee said, it's a talking bee, "What seems to be the problem?" And the man said, "Well, I'm out of gas." The bee told the man to wait right there, and he would come back soon. Minutes later, the man watched as an entire swarm of bees flew to his car and into his gas tank. And after a few minutes, the bees flew out. "Try it now," said the bee. The man turned the ignition key, and the car started right up. "Wow, what did you put in my gas tank?" And the bee answered, "British Petroleum, you know, BP." That's not too hard to get. This past spring, I acquired a slight fascination with bees. I traveled with Julie and Tim Gietler to the St. Louis Association spring meeting in Memphis, and while there, we were given several options to do hands-on ministry or learn about some things that were going on with some churches there, and I chose to learn about a beehive and how they make honey and all that. It was a particular ministry that this church engaged in. It was quite fascinating, and since that experience, I've decided to, I'd read a little bit about the bees. They gave us some flyers and stuff, and I read about, for example, the disappearance of the bees. We've heard about this, but we don't hear as much about it these days, but unfortunately, they still seem to be disappearing. And there's a technical term for this. It's called colony collapse disorder, or CCD. And I'm going to read a definition to you of colony collapse disorder. And when I do so, I want you to think about sort of the disappearing or diminishment of congregations in the mainline Protestant tradition. That's not what I'm going to preach about. I do too much of that, but just kind of listen for this. Colony collapse disorder is the phenomenon that occurs when the majority of worker bees in a colony disappears and leaves behind a queen, plenty of food, and a few nurse bees to care for the remaining immature bees. Now, I know I couldn't believe there are actually something called nurse bees, but they're there. Now, with slight variations, doesn't that sound a little bit like the state of Christianity today? In fact, I would call what we're going through congregational collapse disorder. And I define it this way, and you'll hear the similarity with some slight variation. Congregational collapse disorder is the phenomenon that occurs when the majority of lay people in a congregation disappears and leaves behind a pastor, plenty of resources, and a parish nurse to care for the remaining maturing bees. Okay, or people. And that does sound a little bit like the plight of many of our congregations. Until recently, I didn't realize how much bees are like people. I learned that, for example, like people, bees are usually non-aggressive, but they will sting if they are provoked. If they are provoked. And I thought of this a few days ago while I was reading this passage from the 10th chapter of Hebrews, beginning in verse 24, and this is what it says. "Let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some." Immediately, I don't know why my brain does strange things at times, but it went to this image of using a stick to provoke a beehive. I saw that word provoke, and I thought about provoking a beehive, or worse would be a hornet's or wasp nest, right? And then running as fast as I can away so that I won't get stung. And I thought to myself, is that sort of my job here, is to get my congregation to provoke them to do love and to love and do good deeds? Isn't that sort of like poking a beehive with a stick? Do we need to be provoked, though, to love, to do good deeds? Now, the second part of that statement in Hebrews 10 is just as provocative, pardon the pun, where the writer says to do not neglect to meet together, as is the habit of some. Well, this refers to the social aspect of our faith. Congregations, the way I envision them, are like bees that come together and work together like a beehive. And certainly, we can accomplish much more working together than working separately. Isn't that true? Now, I also learned that not all bees, however, are social animals. They don't all live in hives. Only 10% of bee species are social, and only a small percentage of them will build hives and make honey in their short, brief lives. Most bees, in fact, are solitary creatures living in individual nests, tunneled in the soil or in tree trunks. And I thought, that sounds a lot like human beings. Again, bees and people have a lot in common. Think of the urban-rural divide among human beings. Some of us live together in cities, like big hives, and some of us live far apart from one another in rural areas, live more solitary existence. It also sounds like us in terms of faith, religion, communities of faith in particular. Only a small percentage of people around the world gather in a beehive of whatever their religion of choice is. We'll say Christianity, the church. Only a certain percentage gather together and produce honey together. That is, they produce works of love and good deeds. But it's not enough just to work in the beehive or gather in worship on Sunday mornings. I think on some level we do need to be provoked. We do need to be inspired, prodded to love. We need to be reminded to do these things, to do good deeds, because sometimes we're less likely to do these things, to be provoked. If we're out there buzzing around by ourselves, we don't have that community that can inspire us to work together. And I think that this holds up. For those of you who have spent most of your life in this congregation or in other congregations, think about all the things you've done, the acts of love and good deeds you've done in your life. And doesn't it seem true that much of what you have done, you and I have accomplished because we have been involved and we've been participating in some community of faith? Here's another way to think about this. Doesn't our faith community give us stingers in order to go out and sting people with love and goodness? And again, we can love, we can do good things on our own, all by ourselves. We all have that ability. I'm not saying we don't. But my argument here is that a community of faith is the place where we are provoked, literally provoked, once a week anyway. Every week we are provoked to do something good and loving. The church, in my view, is where God takes a stick and pokes, prods, and provokes until we get stirred up enough to go out and buzz around and make things happen. To use the language of sacrifice, if it means that we sting so hard and so much that we lose our stingers and die, as the bees do, then so be it. Because that's exactly what Jesus did on the cross. So what we have here at Immanuel and other communities of faith is a hive switch. A hive switch. Now I got this phrase from a contemporary writer named Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And he uses this hive switch as a wonderful metaphor about how we all get turned on, we get switched on to do good things as a community. And in this book, Jonathan Haidt says that human nature is 90% chimpanzee and 10% bee. Now, here's what he means by that. We are like chimps in the sense that we are individuals in competition with one another. 90% of the time, that's how we act and behave. That's who we are. We're chimps out doing things for ourselves. But 10% of the time, we are like bees in the sense that we are part of social groups like a church, perhaps in competition with other social groups. But being a part of a group or a hive is what helps us learn to cooperate with others in order to accomplish good things. Again, we are mostly individualistic chimps, living the bulk of our existence for the benefit of ourselves. However, we do have the ability to, quote, transcend self-interest and lose ourselves in something larger than ourselves. And this, according to that writer, is the hive switch. It's a switch that's turned on at about 10% of the time in our lives in order to make our group or our hive more cohesive, more cooperative, and yes, even more competitive with other groups. The switch occurs, there's a lot of switches out there, right? We might even call them triggers. Things that turn us on or off, or, turn the light on, turn the light off, or whatever. We can be provoked in many different ways. I had to admit, I had a little bit of road rage last night. You ever had any road rage? It wasn't a pretty thing. Annie and I, we had bought a couple of pies from a friend. They weren't cooked yet. They were still kind of liquidy in the middle, and we had them in their packages in the back seat. And we came up to a red light, and it turned green. And when I started going through the intersection, well, somebody was tailing, the last car, so I had to wait. I thought about honking my horn, but I didn't. So then I thought, okay, now I can go. And there was a big gap between that car and another car came right at me. And I had to slam on my brakes. And those pies went flying through the car. The pies are no good anymore. I had a little bit of road rage for a few minutes. But a lot of things can happen to us throughout the day that sort of flip our switches and can make us do bad things. It can make us do good things, loving, unloving. The switches are turned all the time. And we have the ability to do these things, good, loving things, as individuals. That is like bees that don't belong to a beehive. And there are many people out there doing their own thing, sometimes very good things, without necessarily needing to be provoked by a supportive community. But you and I, this morning, we have somehow managed to make our way back to the beehive. Why? Because we want to be provoked and we want to be encouraged to make honey. We want God to poke, prod, and provoke us to love one another and love our neighbors as ourselves, even the ones who drive through red lights. And we have met together today, as we do each and every Sabbath day, to provoke one another to do good works as well as loving things. Works that can be done more efficiently and effectively when we do things together as opposed to working by ourselves. And I think that's a really good reason, one of the good reasons to be here on Sunday morning, to be provoked. Okay, so what do you want to take from all this? Very simple. Because we are 90% like the chimps, we are unlikely to do much of unselfish acts of love and good deeds by ourselves. We are less likely to do those things. But because we are 10% like bees, we are more productive in community that provokes us to love and good deeds. So, let's go out and sting a few folks this week. And remember this, you've all heard this, we can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So let's behave like a beehive and make some honey. Amen.